Committee will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules of the committee. We have been told that al-Qaeda is on its last legs, that al-Qaeda died with bin Laden, and that whatever remnants of al-Qaeda that remain are too weak for us to be concerned about. The purpose of this hearing today is to see whether that is a correct statement or an incorrect statement. Prior to 9/11, these locations in red are where al-Qaeda operated prior to 9/11. Since that has occurred, since September 11th occurred, we are now looking at the global al-Qaeda today. The red is al-Qaeda, and the blue are other terrorist groups that operate in these regions of the world, primarily the Middle East and North and Western and Eastern Africa. And our purpose of this committee hearing today is to go into depth about al-Qaeda's presence and, to some extent, other terrorist groups as well. I will submit the rest of my statement for the record, and I will turn over to the ranking member, Mr. Sherman from California, to hear his remarks in his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your brevity. It will not be reciprocated.
You have 5 minutes.
Thank you for your maps. I'll notice that the first map did not show Iran in blue as an area of non-al-Qaeda terrorist base. Certainly, Iran was as worthy of being marked in blue on your first map as on your second. Al-Qaeda has failed to carry out a major attack in the United States since 9/11. However, the danger posed by Al-Qaeda to the United States is still significant. Al-Qaeda structures become more decentralized, less of a integrated corporation, closer to a franchise. Its chief terrorist activities now being conducted by its local and regional affiliates. Over the past few years, al-Qaeda's core in Pakistan has been weakened. We have killed 4 of the top 5 leaders, and of course, who's the top of their leadership changes from time to time as some are dispatched to where they ought to go. On May 23rd of this year, the President outlined tighter rules for drone strikes. The President discussed how our systematic effort to dismantle terrorist organizations must continue. He stated that this war, like all wars, must end, but the intensity of this war is less than virtually all the others that we have faced, and its length is longer than than certainly all of the wars we have faced. Obama's announced intention to work with Congress to refine and ultimately repeal the 2001 authorization for use of military force, which is now 12 years old, is laudable. But even while our activities in Afghanistan wind down, terrorism directed at the United States and its allies remains a significant threat. It is true, as the President says, that not every collection of thugs that uses the al-Qaeda name poses a credible threat to the United States, but it is also true that the war against terrorism is not over. The fastest growing al-Qaeda affiliate is in Syria. Jabhat al-Nusra is emerging as the best motivated, best trained, and best equipped force fighting the Assad regime. The moderate umbrella group, the Free Syrian Army, has been losing fighters and capacities to Jabhat al-Nusra, and Jabhat al-Nusra has even taken to assassinating competing rebel commanders. I'll be interested in learning from our panelists what role Qatar and the Saudis have played in funding Jabhat al-Nusra and other questionable groups in Syria. The Alawite community in Syria is in the crosshairs of Sunni extremists. and we have to arm the best elements in Syria, but do so quite carefully. In March of this year, I joined with Elliot Engel, a ranking member of this committee, and House Intel Chairman Mike Rogers in introducing the Free Syria Act, which would authorize the President to provide lethal assistance to carefully vetted Syrian opposition groups. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, we've seen chaos in Libya since 2011. We've seen it spill into surrounding regions, including the Tuareg fighters who supported Gaddafi and have taken weapons into Mali. And then we saw those weapons in the hands of those who killed 3 Americans in Algeria. It is, of course, the most jingoistic and politically popular thing to say that America should take the lead in everything. The fact is, France took the lead in Mali. We supported, and we have to get away from the natural attractions of machismo and realize this is a complicated conflict in which sometimes we will play a secondary role in some of the theaters. This will be a long effort. I doubt there'll be any triumphal end to this war. We have to manage this problem and do so at the least cost in lives, treasure, the least cost to our privacy, and the least cost to our other competing foreign policy objectives. Eventually, even those who have been told that objectives can be achieved over a period of many decades through terrorism will come to realize that al-Qaeda methods and al-Qaeda ideology will not improve the world, will not bring about a worldwide caliphate, but until we win this war, it will continue. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back the remainder of his time. All other members of the subcommittee who wish to make an opening statement, I'm asking that they submit those for the record. I will introduce each witness and then give them time for their opening statements before questions. Dr. Seth Jones is an Associate Director of the International Security and Defense Policy Center at the RAND Corporation, as well as an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University School for Advanced International Studies. He specializes in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, including a focus on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and al-Qaeda. Dr. Fred Kagan is the Christopher DeMuth Chair and Director of the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute, previously an Associate Professor of Military History at West Point. Dr. Kagan is a contributing editor at the Weekly Standard and has written for Foreign Affairs, the Wall Street Journal, and other periodicals. Mr. Thomas Joslin is a Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a Senior Editor of the Long War Journal. Mr. Joslin is also a frequent contributor to the Weekly Standard and was the Senior Counterterrorism Advisor to Mayor Giuliani during the 2008 presidential campaign. Dr. Thomas Heghammer is the Zuckerman Fellow at Stanford University Center for International Security and Cooperation and a Senior Research Fellow at the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment in Oslo. Dr. Heghammer frequently advises government agencies in North America and in Europe on counterterrorism issues. I want to welcome all 4 of our panelists here today. Each of you have 5 minutes. Your statements have already been made part of the record, and we will stick to the 5-minute rule. After each of you have testified, then the members of the committee will ask you questions. Dr. Jones, you're first.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Sherman, and other members of the committee. Thanks for inviting me and a really esteemed crew here on global al-Qaeda. I would first point out that I think the growth of al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria and other recent developments make this hearing particularly timely and important. In reviewing al-Qaeda's evolution since 1988, I'm going to make 3 arguments in my opening remarks. First, contrary to some interpretations of the weakness of al-Qaeda today, I would respond that it is actually quite resilient. As I look at both al-Qaeda as it stood, reflected in part in your map, Mr. Chairman, there has been a net expansion in the number and the geographic scope of al-Qaeda affiliates and allies over the past decade, indicating that al-Qaeda, at least in my view, is, and the movement are far from defeated. I'll explain in a moment what I mean by al-Qaeda. This growth, in my view, is caused by at least two factors. One is the Arab uprisings, which have weakened regimes across North Africa and the Middle East and created an opportunity for al-Qaeda and its allies to establish or attempt to establish a foothold or a safe haven. I would submit that the developments in Egypt are of particular concern. It is where the current head of al-Qaeda is from, and it is another potential avenue for a foothold depending on how that situation develops over the next several weeks and months. In addition, the growing sectarian struggle across the Middle East between Sunni and Shia, which has been funded by, on the Sunni side, both states and non-state actors, has increased the resources available to militant groups, including to al-Qaeda and its affiliates. So the first point is that I think there's been a slight net expansion in al-Qaeda's geographic scope and its number. Second, however, this expansion has, along with the weakness of central al-Qaeda in Pakistan, recently anyway, has created a more diffuse and decentralized movement. And I do think this is important because I think what we see is we look at Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, Iraq, al-Qaeda in Iraq, Somalia, al-Shabaab, Yemen, the al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in North Africa, the main affiliates. They largely, as I interpret it, run their operations somewhat autonomously, though they still communicate with the core and still may take some strategic advice. And I would note that what's interesting in the Syrian front is the attempt from the core in Pakistan to adjudicate a dispute between al-Qaeda in Iraq and Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, and then to have the affiliate in Syria essentially break away from Iraq, the al-Qaeda in Iraq segment, and swear allegiance directly to the core element in Pakistan, which to me symbolizes that there is still some importance to that leadership. Now, the way I would, if pressed, would define al-Qaeda today, it would include the core in Pakistan. And I would say even if Zawahiri were killed, there are at least three potential replacements that sit in Iran today, all of whom are quite well esteemed and are members of what was called the Management Council, and one that potentially sits that sits in Yemen. So even with the death of Zawahiri, I still think you would get a movement that would continue. And then third, let me just say within this disparate movement, most al-Qaeda affiliates are not actively plotting today attacks against the United States homeland. In the near term, I would probably say the Yemen contingent poses the most serious threat in the sense that we see the most notable plots coming out of Yemen, along with the inspired networks. I think the Boston bombings should be viewed in the al-Qaeda context. Part of the bomb-making reviewed al-Qaeda documents from Inspire magazine, listened to al-Qaeda leaders, including Anwar al-Awlaki, and must be viewed as inspired individuals of al-Qaeda. Other groups do not appear to pose a threat, at least in the near term, to the U.S. homeland. But I think as the Syria context shows, that Jabhat al-Nusra's recruitment and funding networks in Europe in particular should be a cause for U.S. policymakers. So taken together, I'll just conclude by saying these arguments suggest that the U.S. needs to adopt a nuanced approach to countering al-Qaeda. Where there is a direct threat, I think there's opportunity for the U.S. to pursue terrorists. And I think where there's not a direct threat to the U.S. homeland, as we saw in North Africa with al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, having allies like France take the lead is well within our grounds. And let me just say, my final sentence to conclude is, this is going to be likely a long war, much like the Cold War. And I think we need to view it in those terms. This is really a decades-long struggle. Thank you.
Dr. Kagan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Sherman, and thank you to the committee for holding a hearing on this topic and scoped in this way. I think it's extremely important that we be able to have a conversation about what the threat actually is, divorced somewhat from what we actually want to do about it. And so I want to make it clear what I'm not here today to do. I'm not here today to propose a solution. I'm certainly not here today to propose invading other countries or repeating Iraq or something else like that. There's a caricature of what the position is of some of those who critique the current administration's strategy. My main critique is that we do not have a strategy that is remotely adequate, and I think that, as Seth said extremely well, what is required is a nuanced strategy that will require different approaches, that will require creativity, but that above all will understand that the al-Qaeda network is a holistic network, the parts of which interact with one another, and that the administration's attempts to parse out only those groups that currently have the stated intent of attacking the United States and treat them as threats and the others as much less threats or not threats at all is extremely dangerous and distorts the actual threat from the movement as a whole, because as Seth explained, the groups interact with one another in a variety of ways, and they also change their minds. It was not from the al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was not from the outset focused on attacking the United States directly. One would have made long odds that we would not have anything connected to the Islamic Emirate of the Caucasus in any way show up on our shores. Groups do change their positions, and that's something that we need to be very cognizant of. Seth's point about the sectarian war is extremely important. The context within which we are having this conversation today is fundamentally different from the context in which we were having anything like this in the early 2000s, in the early part of the struggle. The sectarian war in the Middle East, which is expanding rapidly, is our concern for a number of reasons. But from this standpoint, it is our concern because that sectarian conflict opens up room and space for radicals like al-Qaeda and affiliates to expand their reach as a way of claiming that they're protecting Sunni populations against Shia attacks. We've seen this in Iraq. It was unfortunately very effective for al-Qaeda in Iraq. And it is effective for al-Qaeda in Iraq again, and it's tremendously effective for Jabhat al-Nusra. The more that you have an expansion of sectarian conflict, the more you will have initiative for and scope for and encouragement for extremist groups, some of them affiliated with al-Qaeda, to take root and take advantage of public fear. I want to highlight a couple of things that I think have been lost in this discussion and thank the terrific staff at Critical Threats Project, Catherine Zimmerman, who's here, and Sasha Gordon, for their work on al-Qaeda and on Yemen in particular. To say part of my concern stems from the fact that the places where we have had strategies, like Yemen, the strategy is failing. It's not working. We've had a strategy of very limited direct attacks against senior al-Qaeda and Arabian Peninsula leaders, coupled with a strategy that focused on diplomatic resolution of the challenges in Sana'a and assistance to the Yemeni security forces. Most of the fighting against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was done by the Yemeni security forces, and they did a very good job of retaking ground that AQAP had taken. And I think the ranking member's point is a very important one. We certainly do need to work through allies whenever possible and strengthen our allies whenever we can in this fight. The problem is that the Yemeni security forces are not only not being strengthened, not only are they being weakened, but they are fracturing. And we've counted more than 24 mutinies in brigade-level units in the Yemeni security forces over the past couple of years. The rate of mutinying has been accelerating. We have had instances of elite units engaged in the fight with al-Qaeda being effectively dissolved in place by mutinies and the Yemeni government response. This is a force that is cracking, unfortunately. And as a result of that, we are seeing AQAP re-attack into Abyan, re-attack into areas that it had been driven out of, and begin to reestablish itself. And I raised this specific case because Yemen has been held up as a model, and there are even some people who ignore the fact that Afghanistan has no coastline and suggest that we should apply the Yemen model to Afghanistan. And before we have that conversation, it's incredibly important to understand that the Yemen model isn't working in Yemen. And if there's any desire on the part of the committee, I would be happy to talk about similar challenges that our strategy in Somalia is facing, where our allies there, who are even more limited in capability, are running into very predictable challenges to their ability to maintain gains, let alone to expand on them. So my bottom line is, I think that Seth may have been a little bit too optimistic. I think that we actually need to consider the possibility that we are starting to lose the war with al-Qaeda, and that we really need to rethink our strategy such as it is very, very fundamentally in light of the fact that we maybe need to recognize that it actually is failing for all the damage that we've done to the core group in Pakistan. Thank you for your time.
Mr. Jocelyn, you have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Poe and Ranking Member Sherman and other members of the committee for having me here today. And I'm honored to be on this panel alongside these gentlemen and to testify before you on this topic. Like Fred, one thing at the outset I'd say is I'm somewhat solution agnostic. I'm basically a nerd who follows the details on a day-to-day basis, and so that's sort of what I'm here to discuss. And I think that there's a good sizable debate to be had about the actual solutions in various areas about how to approach this, what I characterize as they have as well as an expanding enemy. The 3 points, I'd like to keep to the bullet point format. I'll say there are 3 points I'd sort of boil this down to. The first is that a lot of times when we talk about al-Qaeda, we talk about the threat to the U.S. homeland, the ability to carry out mass casualty attacks, and that's understandable. That's the first goal of the U.S. government, is to prevent such attacks. I'd say from a comprehensive review of al-Qaeda's literature and a comprehensive review of their assets and their operational capacity, that has not been their only goal throughout their entire existence, not even close. That attacking us was always a tactic as part of their larger stratagem in the game that they're playing, which involves politics in a variety of countries and insurgencies and guerrilla warfare along those lines. In that regard, I would point to the 9/11 Commission report, which pointed to very early on, now more than 2 decades ago, that Osama bin Laden actually employed a strategy of what I characterize as planting seeds in a variety of countries to try and hopefully cultivate what we now see as affiliates or branches. Now, these efforts have not been fruitful in every country. They've had fits and starts, and they've not always worked out. But I would argue that in some ways, in some spectacular ways, these efforts have actually worked. And so I don't think the growth of the affiliates is, in fact, a surprise or anything we should take as some sort of random event that just happens by happenstance. The second point is the committee expressed interest in sort of the delineation between al-Qaeda's core and the affiliates. Part of my concern is that we talk about the al-Qaeda core as if it's this group in Afghanistan and Pakistan solely, which is totally distinct from everything else that's going on around the world, and that therefore if we just kill off the core, the threat from al-Qaeda as it manifested itself on 9/11 is no longer a worry for us. I think even the Bush administration got into that at times as well, making statements like we had killed 75% of senior al-Qaeda leaders. President Obama has now said that we killed 73% of senior al-Qaeda leaders. You kind of wonder, how many senior al-Qaeda leaders, how many times we kill 3/4 of their senior al-Qaeda leaders. They're able to replace their ranks. And in that vein, al-Qaeda's core is not confined, I would argue, to Afghanistan and Pakistan. The way I look at it, based on al-Qaeda's literature, including a recently published letter from Ayman al-Zawahiri, is that that's basically where their general command is actually headquartered. And they have a series of committees and advisors surrounding Ayman al-Zawahiri. But the general command dispatches operatives around the globe to oversee their interests. And I won't get into the nerd analysis for you right now, but I can point to specific operatives who we know are in touch with the general command, who have been dispatched by the general command, and they're operating in places such as Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Sinai, across the globe, basically. The third and final point is that a lot of the discussion centers on, of course, again, the threat to the U.S. homeland, and we should be happy that they haven't been able to execute something on the level of a 9/11 style attack. That's the good news. Certainly, America's defenses have improved through the years. We've thwarted plots. We've also gotten lucky on occasion in avoiding mass casualty attacks. But I just want to highlight something in my testimony. When you talk about the threats to the U.S. homeland now, they are more diffuse, not just abroad, but also to us here in this country. Since 2009, the way I look at it, there have been plots from al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, again starting on the Christmas Day 2009, plots by the Pakistani Taliban in May 2010, which had the failed Times Square bombing. They actually took credit for that at my website. They emailed us credit for that operation. The Pakistani Taliban, according to the Obama administration, which has done a good job of describing the Pakistani Taliban, has a symbiotic relationship with al-Qaeda. There's a recent plot earlier this year connected to al-Qaeda members in Iran, which involved derailing the train from New York to Toronto. And we've seen recent evidence that al-Qaeda in Iraq, according to the Iraqi government anyway, may have considered dispatching operatives to launch some sort of chemical weapons attack in Europe and also the U.S. In that regard, I point out that al-Qaeda in Iraq actually was tied to the 2007 failed attacks in Glasgow and in London, and was actually tasked in 2004 by al-Qaeda's General Command with coming up with a plan to attack us. So just to wrap this up quickly, most of the affiliates spend most of their assets doing something else, fighting guerrilla warfare, trying to gain turf for themselves elsewhere. Most of their assets are not deployed against us in any immediate threat capacity. However, I think we have to be very careful not to assume away that threat and to understand that these threats manifest themselves very rapidly. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Heghammer, is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. You have 5 minutes, sir. Thank you for coming from California to be here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me, and thank you, ranking member, and all of the distinguished members of the subcommittee. It's a great honor to be here. I have been doing academic research on al-Qaeda since before 9/11, and never has the future of the jihadi movement seemed more unpredictable to my eyes than it does today. Still, for this testimony, I have decided to try to look ahead and speculate about the long-term future of al-Qaeda. And in these opening remarks, I'll highlight my 3 most important conclusions. First, it is my assessment that we are past the peak of organized jihadi terrorism in the West. Al-Qaeda core is weak, and most affiliates are not systematically targeting the U.S. homeland. The main threat in the next 2, 3, perhaps 5 years is ad hoc attacks by unaffiliated agents, which are harder to prevent but less lethal on average. Affiliates seem to be holding their fire against the West, partly because they have primarily local agendas for which overseas operations are not very useful, and partly because they seem to fear the U.S. military response that comes with attacks on the homeland. So deterrence, in other words, appears to be part of the story here. And to maintain this deterrent vis-à-vis jihadi organizations, the U.S., in my view, should continue to use military force in counterterrorism selectively, primarily against those groups with a proven willingness to attack the U.S. homeland. Using heavy force against groups that have not yet attacked us runs the risk of provoking the very behavior we're trying to prevent. My second and more pessimistic point is that the jihadi movement writ large is thriving and will be with us for another decade at least. I think that the optimists were basically wrong in commenting on the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was not an end of the Cold War moment for jihadism. Al-Qaeda core may be very weak, and al-Shabaab in Somalia may be experiencing setbacks, but the other affiliates are doing just fine. And the new Ansar al-Sharia groups in North Africa are growing. The Syrian war, with its staggering numbers of foreign fighters, has been a major boost to the movement. But for now, most of these groups are not targeting the West. This could change, however, and we should pay particular attention, in my view, to Jabhat al-Nusra, because it disposes of so many Western operatives. My third point, which is more of a guess, really, is that I expect to see a second wave of serious plots in the West, some 4, 5, 6 years down the line. And the most likely perpetrator will be an organization that we do not yet know about. It could, of course, come from existing affiliates as well, but these groups have the disadvantage of being known to us, and they're led by people who have seen what drones can do. This means they're less likely to try systematically attacking the West, and if they do, we know where to direct the retaliation. Future groups, on the other hand, might be less visible to our agencies and be led by a new generation prone to overestimating their own capabilities. Their chances of success will depend on our continued vigilance and ability to spot such grouplets early. So more than ever, we need a concerted effort, both in the intelligence community and the academy, to make sense of this rapidly changing jihadi landscape. Thank you for your attention.
I want to thank all four of you for being here. I want to go back to the map that I showed you earlier. I want your comment on the map. It's over to your left or right, whichever way you want to look. And you can see that, according to this map, al-Qaeda's presence is in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, Algeria, Mali, Niger, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, and Nigeria. Do any of you, my question is, do you agree that those are accurate countries that al-Qaeda has a presence in or not? Dr. Jones?
Mr. Chairman, just looking at that for the first time, I would say that al-Qaeda or one of its allies is present in the countries you have identified. Let me just say two things. One is that in some of these cases, I would call them really an al-Qaeda affiliate in the case of Somalia and Yemen. In other cases, as in parts of Algeria, there may be the group, those who signed with blood, or down in Mali, Ansar al-Din, allies, have a foreign affiliate.
Al-Qaeda are al-Qaeda affiliates. Yes. Let's use that terminology. Dr. Kagan?
Yeah, like Dr. Jones, I would agree that there are al-Qaeda or affiliated or allied movements in all of those states. We might argue about some of the blobology, and I think the Afghan presence at the moment is a little less than is implied there, but right. In general terms, yes.
Mr. Jocelyn?
You know, it's funny, we have this conversation about putting together a map at the Long War Journal constantly about how to do this, because it's actually very tricky.
You can use my map.
Yeah, I agree with most of it. I'd have to sort of pick at it a little bit. I mean, I think, see, here's the challenge, okay? You look at, example, an area like the Sinai, where we're tracking terrorists right now, and who's there, and we're tracking al-Qaeda operatives right there, and they seem to have built a force in the hundreds, if not thousands, in the Sinai right now. Including specific individuals. In fact, there's a great article up at the Long War Journal today about a former doctor to bin Laden who's been basically running some jihadists there. The problem is, I agree with most of the map. I'd have to sort of pick over it a little bit more. But I think it does make sense to say that you have al-Qaeda or affiliated groups. Then you also have associated movements, which the collusion there is often a lot stronger than people give them credit for.
And there's some wannabes in the groups, too.
There's some wannabes. You have some guys who are really just flying the flag, who aren't really connected to the overall network. But I think there are a number of groups. You know, Seth had mentioned Ansar al-Din, for example. The Treasury Department's designation of them is very clear, State Department's designation is very clear, that they've been working very carefully and closely with AQIM for a long time. Right. You know, so it's reasonable to include those groups in your map.
All right. Dr. Heghammer.
Well, I agree largely with the map and also with the comments that have been made already. I would also have added perhaps a little red dot in the Sinai.
Little red dot to the Sinai, okay.
Yeah. In Egypt, yes. But I would also mention in this context that the size of the area covered is not necessarily a measure of strength. Some of the groups happen to be in desolate areas, so they get a lot of red ink there.
Because there's nobody else there.
That's right.
There's nobody in those areas.
Whereas some of the smaller dots have very powerful affiliates.
Thank you. Dr. Kagan, if I wrote your comments down correctly, you said that the United States lacks a overall strategy. What does that mean? And explain it briefly.
Sir, I do not think that we have articulated a strategy for defeating al-Qaeda as a global network with affiliates and its associates. I think that we have undertaken a collection of tactics, and we have made a number of broad statements about this, but I believe that this is a challenge that is worthy of the kind of analytical and planning effort that went into NSC 68 or any other extremely serious war. And candidly, especially after the death of Osama bin Laden, I would have looked for a major planning effort of that variety to think about what the next stage was. And I do not believe, at least if that's happened, then I'm completely unaware of it.
So if I understand what you said, overall strategy of the United States to deal with al-Qaeda operatives, affiliates, we don't have one of those. But if events occur, we have tactical response to each specific attack.
Well,
is that a fair statement or not?
More than that. I mean, there is an offensive component to what the Obama administration is attempting to do, and there is a theory behind, I think, what they're undertaking with their targeted strikes and other activities. But I don't see a coherent, holistic strategy that says this is the network we're looking at, these are the effects we need to generate on the network, these are how we're going to apply all the tools of government and so forth to do that. And I think it's going to require an effort of that magnitude to scope the problem and then scope a strategy that might be successful.
Let me ask you this question. I want to talk about al-Nusra in Syria and their influence in Syria. What are they doing in Syria? I guess of all the rebel groups there, I'm concerned about them. But how influential are they, and what are they actually doing? Anybody want to weigh in on that? You all know, so
sure,
just somebody tell me.
I'm happy to keep talking. Jabhat al-Nusra is extremely influential in Syria, and I think its influence is generally growing. That has largely to do with its ability to receive large amounts of external aid.
From
Qatar, from other countries in the Gulf, and from the international
governments are supporting al-Nusra?
I can't prove that governments are supporting Jabhat al-Nusra.
But you think they are?
But I believe that the Qatari government has been, and I've seen indications that the Kuwaiti government may be as well, or elements within the Kuwaiti government may be as well. Certainly private jihadi donors within the Gulf and elsewhere in the world are supporting the movement, and as a result of that, it's probably the best armed and equipped fighting force in Syria. I think we're already in a situation where there is going to be a conflict between the Free Syrian Army and the moderate forces that it represents and Jabhat al-Nusra under almost any scenario, unless there's a complete Assad victory, which I think is very unlikely. And right now, my assessment is Jabhat al-Nusra probably would win that fight.
So as we progress, those are the two factions on either side that are going to come to conflict, and your money is on al-Nusra.
Unless the situation changes, I think that Jabhat al-Nusra has the advantage. They also have an advantage in that they've been establishing local government, and they have been setting up local authorities in various different parts of Syria that they control and trying to build themselves. Now, I don't think they actually have a whole lot of popular support for the ideology, but we've seen this phenomenon before, that they're effective defenders, and therefore they put themselves into leadership roles.
Thank you. Ranking Member, Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. I don't want the panel to think that the absence of Democrats here reflects any disinterest, or that my own absence soon will do that. As it happens, we've scheduled an important caucus meeting at the same time as this hearing, and of course this hearing was delayed by votes on the floor. My concern is not just with an attack on the American homeland, although that is a natural focus. I think that attacks on U.S. interests abroad and overthrow of relatively friendly governments pose as great a threat to us as anything else, even an attack of a modest attack, at least on the U.S. homeland. I'm concerned not just with al-Qaeda and its affiliates, but just about any one inspired by the same movement. This is a a complicated area. I mean, in World War II, we could put a color on a map. There were neutrals, there were countries on our side, there were countries against us. Kuwait exists only because we liberated them. Now we're told that the Kuwaiti government and elements in it are allowing private monies and even government monies to go Jabhat al-Nusra. That confuses me a little bit. What confuses me more is the testimony we've heard that on the one hand, Iran is sheltering 3 of the most important al-Qaeda leaders. On the other hand, Jabhat al-Nusra may be part of an effort to obliterate the Alawite community. This focuses our attention on the Shiite-Sunni divide and Iran. Does Iran have those al-Qaeda leaders under house arrest, or should we call it hospitality? Mr. Jocelyn.
Well, the answer is both, but I'd point out, because what Seth's talking about in terms of the network inside Iran, this is very important. In July of 2011, then December of 2011, then February of 2012, and then October of 2012, the Obama administration's Treasury and State Departments designated an al-Qaeda network inside Iran that operates under an agreement between the Iranian regime and al-Qaeda. So those are the 4 things I would point you to go look at that comes, and there's specific factual detail in those designations. It's a very rigorous process that the Treasury Department and State Department go through to explain that. What they've done is, since 2005 at least, there's been a facilitation network inside Iran to basically shuttle fighters to South Asia and elsewhere. And simultaneously, the Iranian regime...
So those who are motivated can arrive in Iran and then end up in Afghanistan or Pakistan?
Sure, and in some cases I uncovered, for example, that in 2010, one of Osama bin Laden's last plots against the West used the same facilitation network to try and execute Mumbai-style attacks in Europe. So it is a robust facilitation network.
Okay, I see what al-Qaeda gets out of it. They get a sanctuary in a place where we're reluctant to use drones.
Sure.
What does Iran get out of it?
Well, I think they want to influence where al-Qaeda is attacking. They don't want al-Qaeda coming after them. They also have common enemies. They have common interests throughout. They don't have common enemies in Syria right now, which is why I think your question was really pointed out, which is exactly right.
Wouldn't it upset the alliance, if you will, for Iranians to know that this is a group bent on the destruction of the Alawite community when Iran sees itself first and foremost as a defender of Shiites, even different flavors of Shiites than they themselves embrace?
Sure. Even beyond that, you have Hezbollah and the IRGC on one side of the Syrian war and al-Qaeda and its affiliate and related groups on the other. So they're directly in conflict. I mean, this is something we're watching right now. Just to your point, Mohammed al-Zawahiri, who's the brother of Ayman al-Zawahiri, for example, released a statement calling for attacks against Shiite-led governments because of what's happening in Syria. So this is the type of statement from somebody in al-Qaeda's sphere that shows there's clearly tension over Syria. The head of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, has certainly ratcheted up the rhetoric against Iran as well.
Finally, where does al-Qaeda and its affiliates and allies get their money? And have we been all too willing to do business with those who countenance such contributions?
Somebody else want to take it?
Dr. Jones.
Sure. The proper answer is it depends on which affiliates you're referring to. There's a lot of redundancy among al-Qaeda's affiliates. Some are involved in illegal or in some cases legal charcoal trade. Most get some funding from different players in the Gulf.
Charcoal?
Yes.
There is a high-profit item.
Well, when you're able to tax various elements of it, you might be surprised. But the broader point, timber trading, gem trading, there have been a range of, when you control territory in a given area, you can tax individuals living there. So there's a redundancy in funding.
So what portion, looking at all the allies and affiliates of al-Qaeda as a group, what portion of their money comes from, what would I say, revenues they've generated, and what percentage comes from donations from governments and individuals in the Islamic world?
I would say I could not put a percentage, and I would say I have never seen anybody put a reliable percentage on it.
Give me your best guess.
I would say that a fairly significant amount of funding of al-Qaeda's core and its affiliates does come from wealthy donors, is the way I'd put it, in the Gulf.
Okay, I'll ask each member of the panel if you can just give me your best guess number. What percentage from the wealthy donors? What percentage from?
Sir, I don't make up numbers, and I've never seen evidence.
You know, I've never seen a specific budget. However, I would say this. I agree with Seth that a significant percentage comes from donors in the Gulf, for sure.
And one quick follow-up, maybe the doctor can, and that is, what happened to Osama bin Laden's personal fortune, and is that being deployed by this, or what happened? You know, he was once worth tens of millions of dollars. Go ahead.
Regarding the first question, I would also say that I don't know, and I haven't seen any numbers from people who know. My guess would be that the proportion of funds coming straight from donors in the Gulf to al-Qaeda and its affiliates as a whole is relatively small, although this varies between affiliates. So perhaps the only affiliate that we, in the open source world, know the accounts of was al-Qaeda in Iraq in the mid-2000s, and they got quite a lot of their money from the foreign fighters that were coming from the Gulf, that were bringing money with them. That was their main support. But if you go to another group, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, they get most of the money from a completely different one, which is kidnappings.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. As the ranking member mentioned, the Democrat Party has an important caucus this afternoon, and yes, you may. I'll yield. And he may need to leave. So I'll turn questioning over to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thanks for your testimony, particularly enlightening for me with some not surprising but new news with Qatar and Kuwait being brought into the discussion. Like I said, not surprising, but a little new for me anyhow. Having served in Iraq, Tom, you served there as well, I got to tell you, I was particularly frustrated, disappointed, and disagreeing with the administration on the lack of a status of forces agreement when we departed. I'd like, I think, Dr. Kagan, maybe Dr. Jones, your comment on the effects of that regarding al-Qaeda particularly, and then looking forward to Afghanistan, recent posturing, whether it's posturing or not, the same relative discussion regarding Afghanistan and a status of forces agreement in relation to a resurgent or revitalized al-Qaeda in both areas.
I think it's a very good questions. I think the failure to establish and reach a status of forces agreement in Iraq and the U.S. Withdrawal allowed two things. It allowed al-Qaeda in Iraq to regenerate. Its attacks are greater this year than they were in the last year of U.S. involvement in 2011. And second, and perhaps more important there, it allowed al-Qaeda in Iraq to help establish Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. Those were two, I think, devastating steps in that region that the U.S. Withdrawal from Iraq at least allowed. And second, that means that the agreement in Afghanistan, assuming it comes, will be quite important. I think if the United States leaves Afghanistan with an active al-Qaeda presence up in Kunar, Nuristan, Nangarhar provinces, it does create the possibility for a reestablishment of the organization in an area that it does have local allies.
Congressman, thank you for your service, and thank you for your question. I think you can identify three main reasons why the departure of U.S. forces from Iraq has contributed to the revitalization of al-Qaeda in Iraq. One was that the Iraqi security forces was not designed to be able to continue to conduct operations against AQI without American enablers. We knew as we were building the ISF that it would not have the capability to replicate our ISR capabilities, to replicate our precision strike capabilities, or to do a variety of other things that were allowing us and allowing the Iraqi security forces to conduct precise operations that were effective, highly effective against the al-Qaeda organization. What we've seen as we've watched Iraqi security forces try to operate against the movement is that they've reverted to patterns that would be familiar to people who have watched how they tried to operate on their own in 2006. And they have been largely ineffective, although they have been in some cases courageous. That pattern would be replicated in Afghanistan. The Afghan National Security Forces, in my opinion, are incapable of operating effectively without American enablers after 2014. And we would be inviting exactly the same situation in Afghanistan that we have in Iraq now if we withdrew all of our enablers. The second major driver in Iraq has been that the departure of all of our forces, which also, not inevitably perhaps, but coincidentally perhaps, matched the departure of effectively all of our influence in the country, enabled, perhaps encouraged Prime Minister Maliki to embrace his sectarian side. And it's surely not an accident that it was pretty much on the way home from Washington, D.C., that he gave the orders to have Vice President Tariq al-Hashemi arrested, which began a process of sectarianization, driving the Sunni out of the political process. We had been acting as a significant brake on that kind of sectarianism by putting pressure on him, by having visibility on the situation. We are performing a different role in Afghanistan, but still a stabilizing role that would go away. And lastly, we were performing a critical peacekeeping function along the Green Line between the Kurds and the Arabs. And we've seen revival of conflict along that line now, and I think you could fear a revival of civil war in Afghanistan if we cease to play a peacekeeping role there.
So real quickly, and not many seconds for big foreign policy issues like this, but if you could, the future of al-Qaeda in Iraq based on current trends and their proclivities as you see them, either any one of you gentlemen, and then our relationship with Pakistan post a pullout of Afghanistan and a resurgent al-Qaeda.
Well, I'm very concerned about the trajectory that al-Qaeda in Iraq is on, particularly conjoined because you can't separate it from the trajectory that Jabhat al-Nusra is on. And I fear the possibility of the establishment of an effectively al-Qaeda-controlled area that crosses from western Iraq into eastern Syria along those tribal lines. And of course, as you know, the tribes straddle the border as well. That's of tremendous concern to me, and I think that the issue of threat to the United States, as my colleagues have made, is important because we need to think about the capabilities and capacities that an organization that had that kind of breathing space would have to plan, develop, and conduct attacks against the United States if it so chose. And I find that very, very worrisome, and I find the likelihood that it will continue to deteriorate in Iraq very high. And I have a very serious concern that I would like to air here, which is that there will be a natural tendency for the United States to be drawn in on the side of Nouri al-Maliki in the name of conducting operations against al-Qaeda in Iraq. And those of you who have served in Iraq and have seen that on the ground know exactly what the danger is. We really will run the risk of becoming the hit squad, a sectarian hit squad for Maliki, in a way that will simply make us appear to be the enemy of the Sunni people without being effective against this group. So we are going to have to approach this with a great deal of nuance and complexity, such as I don't see apparent so far in our discussions about this, such as there have been any.
The next turn to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Snyder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony and insights today. I'd like to pick up, Dr. Kagan, you talked a little bit about Syria and al-Qaeda's increasing influence in Syria. We recently saw the assassination of Commander Kamal Hamami, who is one of the senior members of the Military Council. And Dr. Jones, in your testimony, you submitted testimony, you talked about a U.S. strategy. It would include, I'll quote you, 3 steps: utilizing a light footprint strategy, improving the effectiveness of governments in countries threatened by al-Qaeda, and undermining al-Qaeda's ideology to help weaken al-Qaeda. In Syria in particular, which in many ways someone once described in this room as a hub state at the center, how do you all, and I'll throw it to the whole panel, how do you see our strategy developing to address the threat of al-Qaeda in Syria to take us in a direction that will provide the best outcome in a very bad situation?
Well, I think the results are fairly straightforward. The decision not to intervene in any way in Syria strengthened al-Qaeda's affiliate Jabhat al-Nusra. It is, as I think virtually everybody here has said, it is probably the most capable al-Qaeda affiliate on the globe, with the weapons it has seized, among other places, from Syrian military bases that it has helped overrun. I think the strategy has got to include two elements of it which may appear contradictory, but I think one can find ways to deal with. One is to take down the Assad regime, and second is to weaken Jabhat al-Nusra at the same time. I'm not sure we're doing either particularly effectively right now.
Thank you. As you look at Jabhat al-Nusra, and my understanding is, in addition to Jabhat al-Nusra, there are other al-Qaeda fighters coming into Syria from other places. Taking down, as we work to take down the Assad regime, the other al-Qaeda fighters in weakening the Free Syrian Army, the prospects for the opposition, how do we address that issue?
Well, I think if you look at Syria today, and you look at some of the polling data that has come out of the region, it looks like the support for al-Qaeda's ideology, including Jabhat al-Nusra's ideology in Syria, is small, is minimal. We saw it recently in Mali when the French deployed. I think the issue is sidelining I think the bulk of the Sunni opposition to the Assad regime does not buy into Jabhat al-Nusra's ideology of an Islamic emirate, at least in their vision. I don't think the bulk of the population in Syria supports an Islamic emirate, at least in the al-Qaeda vision. And so I think the way to do this is to work with a range of those opposition groups to target and undermine the ideology of Jabhat al-Nusra. I don't think there is much popular support within Syria for al-Qaeda's ideology. That is, in my view, their biggest weakness, not just in Syria, but in other areas we see them operate, is they need a vacuum. They don't have a lot of popular support.
I think that's a great point, but Dr. Kagan, as you mentioned, the potential for a vacuum across the border between Iraq and Syria in that land where you do have tribal affinities. Any thoughts or advice you would have to us how to address that or what to be watchful for?
Yes, look, I'm happy to say very forthrightly that we need to be providing lethal support to the Free Syrian Army, and we need to be, because that is one of the best ways to accomplish the goals that Seth identified, which are the correct goals. On the one hand, hastening the fall of the Assad regime. The protraction of this war is one of the greatest dangers to national security from the standpoint of bringing in more foreign fighters, strengthening the al-Qaeda front, turning this more and more into a sectarian conflict. The sooner that one can move past that stage, if it's possible, and now it's looking much harder, the better it would be. But most of all, because I believe that there is very likely to be a conflict between the moderate forces, which I entirely agree with Seth, represent the will of the majority of the Syrian people, and Jabhat al-Nusra, it's critical for us that the moderate forces win that fight. And we should be working now to ensure that the outcome of that fight is not in doubt, which might be a way of limiting its scale when it actually happened. And that would have positive effects in Iraq also. It's obviously very difficult to imagine what we could do directly in Iraq to shape the situation there. But anything that we can do to weaken the rear of al-Qaeda in Iraq and its ability to use Syria as a base of support, which it is using now, would limit its ability to operate freely in Iraq. But I don't have a good answer for you about what to do in Iraq.
Right. Thank you. I wish I had more time, but I see that I'm out. I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Just a follow-up question from Mr. Snyder's comments. You mentioned strategy and strategy. Big picture, what is al-Qaeda's strategy? What's the point? Can you keep it simple, Dr. Jones?
I'll keep it simple. In my view, Ayman al-Zawahiri's strategy includes the establishment of a caliphate that cuts across North Africa, the Middle East, and into South Asia. If you were to ask the affiliate leaders, you'd probably get a more parochial answer, Islamic Emirates in their regions. So I think the core would have a slightly different answer than most of your affiliate leaders.
All right. We'll turn now to Mr. Cotton from Arkansas for 5 minutes.
Can I answer your question as well, Judge Poe?
Yes, you can answer my question.
I think their strategy is simple. They want to eject America from where they want to establish a caliphate, and they want to kill you, and they want to kill your constituents. That's what I think their strategy is. Can we talk about what I might call the ghost of Syria future? Al-Nusra right now is a potent force in Syria. 2.5, 3 years ago, was there much al-Qaeda presence at all in Syria? Could we just go down the panel? Does anyone think there was much al-Qaeda presence in Syria 2.5, 3 years ago before the uprising?
No, there was a Syrian. Syria was used as a major funnel for fighters into Iraq, so it was used for Iraq facilitation routes.
Yeah,
but that was a very limited and carefully controlled, ironically, by the Assad regime pipeline, because he feared precisely this would happen. So it was a very limited presence.
That's right. There was a pipeline that was run by Abu Ghadia, who was the al-Qaeda facilitator, who actually U.S. forces had to take direct military action against him inside Syria because the Assad regime wouldn't crack down on him. He was aided by Asif Shakat and other Syrian officials. Yeah.
Dr. Heckheimer?
I concur with what's been
said. So not much presence in al-Qaeda in Syria 2.5, 3 years ago. Target of opportunity has arisen. I've asked for the map to be put back up. The point here is not the extent of the blobs, but where they circle around AQIM, Syria, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Shabaab, are all forming a circle around Egypt. I would like to get your perspective on the risk that we face of having the kind of magnet or flypaper effect in Egypt, given the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood was founded there. It's intellectually and philosophically the heart of the Arab world. Ayman al-Zawahiri is Egyptian, has deep ties there, and the risk that America faces either of a situation like Syria or perhaps a situation like Algeria going forward in Egypt.
I think we've already seen we already saw a statement within the last week from leaders of al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, al-Nusra Front, and al-Shabaab supporting jihad against the Egyptian military in Egypt. I would also note that the Mohammed Jamal group was involved in the assassination of U.S. Ambassador Stevens in Libya. So Egypt is concerning for, as several people here have said, what's going on in Sinai, what's going on with Mohammed Jamal's network in Egypt, and also what we're seeing as potential support for the opposition to the Egyptian military.
Dr. Kagan.
In addition, I agree with everything that Seth said. In addition to that, we're tracking fighters moving from Gaza into Egypt in order to fight the Egyptian military as part of this takeover. There have been a number of wannabe claims, and wannabe claims are wannabe claims until they do something and then they get recognized. So I don't think we should dismiss them. I'm deeply concerned about this, and it has the revolution against Morsi, or whatever we're going to call it, has absolutely cemented a narrative of "I told you so" from the faction, from Zawahiri's faction, which had always rejected the political course, and their slogan now is "bullets, not ballots." So I'm very concerned.
Just real quick, al-Qaeda has been pursuing a two-pronged strategy in Egypt since 2011. One is dawah, or proselytization, inside Egypt's urban areas and settled areas. We don't know how extensive those efforts have been fruitful in terms of earning new recruits, but keep your eyes out for it. They've also used the urban areas as facilitation points for the attack in Libya and elsewhere. And simultaneously in the Sinai, they've been building this contingency of al-Qaeda-related groups in the hundreds or thousands in the Sinai, and I pretty much guarantee you're going to see terrorist attacks from that group very soon.
I agree. I think there's a very clear risk of more violence in Egypt in the coming year. But I do think also that in the mid and long term, that threat is manageable, both because the militants in Sinai will be squeezed between, a police state in central Egypt and Israel. So those actors together will, I think, be able to manage that threat. But so the casualty here will be democracy in Egypt and the sort of the momentum of the Arab Spring.
Thank you all for your time and your perspective. Let's hope that the map in 2015 doesn't have a blob in Egypt.
Thank you, sir. Gentlemen, I appreciate you being here, and it's an honor to have so much wisdom here. And if we were to add all your degrees up together, it would look like a thermometer. So I appreciate you guys being here. We've got to get this right. I mean, I look out along the group here, and I see a lot of young people. And I'm 58 years old, and when I look back, when we had the first oil embargo, that was in the 70s. And we've been dealing with Middle East conflicts in this country for a long time. We've got to get it right. We want to keep our young men and women here to grow America strong. And I want to start with you, Dr. Jones. You also you stated that you felt al-Qaeda was not a direct threat to the U.S., but they claimed responsibility for 9/11, and indirectly with the Boston Marathon, as you said, Mr. Jocelyn, that Osama bin Laden wanted to spread the seeds of al-Qaeda or jihad by seeding countries all over the world, and these were people that were sympathetic to their beliefs. And I think we see that happening. I think Boston was a great example of that. Unfortunately, it was here. And so my questions come back to, what is the sentiment and the mindset of al-Qaeda fundamentalists today versus that at its creation back in the 80s towards the U.S. and Western countries, I guess Western beliefs more in general? And if I want to kind of rotate between you guys, so if you would first just kind of answer that question.
Two things. One is I do believe al-Qaeda is a threat. Not all of its affiliates pose a threat. On your question, I think the biggest difference is the social network and social media has allowed the views of key al-Qaeda leaders to influence young Muslims in multiple locations. And so what we've seen is, and what makes this different, I think the ideology coming from Ayman al-Zawahiri, in my view, is not that different from what he was writing about in 1998 and 2000 and 2001. But he's got more access to key mediums to push that information out, to influence individuals so that the organization can be more decentralized. You can reach Americans in Detroit and New York and Boston online.
Right.
And that makes this a very different organization than what existed back in September 11th, and in many ways a more dangerous one.
All right, let me ask you guys this, and you guys all join in this. So would you consider our lack of border security, could that be a national security threat? You know, not just our northern border, but our southern and our coastal. And just, is that a national security threat, the lack of border security that we have in this country today?
It is a cause. It should be a cause of concern. Yes, there are foreigners that are moving back and forth across the U.S.-Mexican border. All
right, and that was going to be my other question. Do you believe the entry through our borders is a security concern, and are they coming? So, Dr. Kagan.
It is a concern, but I would say that what we're seeing that concerns me even more is a tendency in the policy debate and in the administration's policies to try to redraw the defensive line where we're going to actually take action at our borders or inside our country. And although the border issue is important, if we harden our borders as much as we want to, but give the enemy all the free hits they want from outside, I guarantee you they will find a way through our very large borders, even if we harden them more.
Okay. Mr. Jocelyn,
it is
the national security threat through our borders.
It is a national security concern threat. I can tell you that Hezbollah in particular is one of the terrorist organizations that uses it as facilitation. My view is that anywhere that there is a open or permissive environment, our enemies are pretty good at finding it.
Dr. Haghammer, I'm sorry.
In my view, the main challenge is identifying the people with a bad intention crossing the border, because we have to let people cross borders. The problem is,
we're just talking about securing them, not closing them. So I agree.
Right. So in that case, I don't think that increasing sort of the hard physical measures will have a particularly great effect on this. And most of the operatives that are coming in through legal means.
Okay. So you kind of answered my next question, and I want to see if the sentiment's the same with all of you. So based on your statements and answers, you recommend securing the borders, you know, the southern, northern, and our coastal borders to a certain degree more than we have now. Would you all agree pretty much with that? We'll take that as an affirmative. My last question is, and this goes back to developing policy so that we can get it right for now and from this point forward. How do you mount a campaign against an ideology that, like radical Islam, whose goal is to remove the kafir or the non-believer, that, you know, or the Western ideologies, when there's not a nation state and when there's not an identified leader? What policies would you recommend that America can do in the Middle East or around the world that would make us more effective at this? If you guys can kind of briefly go through that, and if you guys don't mind.
Well, I think one of the major mistakes the U.S. has made in the last several decades is to get rid of organizations like the U.S. Information Agency that did provide a way to push back against ideologies. If you look at the successes against the U.S. against the Soviet Union, it was things like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty and the U.S. Information Agency that were able to combat that ideology. We do not have a organized, collective effort to push back against extremist ideology. Where it has been done successful, and I think it's worth looking at the successful efforts, Saudi Arabia, in facing a very serious threat in Saudi Arabia from al-Qaeda between 2002 and 2008, and Tom has written a really good book about this, did use a very effective strategy to delegitimize al-Qaeda in their state. So we got some good examples of where it's been done. We've got some good historical examples. I think we need to push those two together.
Could those policies be used here in the United States? I mean, we've got two different governmental systems here.
Yes, some of them can,
Okay.
because it involved getting moderates to come out against moderate Muslims to come out against.
All right, let me hear from Dr. Kagan real quick.
One of the most effective things that I saw in my time in Afghanistan was the JET team, the Jordanian education team, which went around. It was a de-radicalizing Jordanian preacher, and he just went around and collected crowds of hundreds and told them what the Quran and the Hadith actually say, which is not what they had been told. We actually absolutely have tools. Now, we're obviously not going to bring Jordanians around to do that here, but we actually have tools to do this. But I want to make a key point here. The ideology does not exist in a vacuum. We are fighting an organization that has embodied this ideology now, and it is seen to have embodied this ideology. If al-Qaeda is seen to succeed, the ideology will be seen to be successful. If al-Qaeda is seen to be defeated, the ideology will be to a considerable extent discredited. And we really mustn't imagine that we can talk about the ideology, and I know you weren't suggesting this, but that we can talk about the ideology as distinct from its pragmatic, practical manifestation in the world today.
All right, Mr. Jocelyn.
Just real quick, one of the biggest looming issues for al-Qaeda ideologically and otherwise is the slaughter of their fellow Muslims around the world. More victims of al-Qaeda and associated terror have been Muslims than Westerners or any other religion. That's generally who they kill. And that is a big problem that they have message-wise. What I have not seen is a unified purpose across the board to emphasize that everywhere we can, that understanding that their principal enemies are actually their fellow Muslims and not the West on a day-to-day basis.
Do you mind if I ask Dr. Hagehammer? Dr. Hagehammer?
So I think that today it's very difficult to undermine this ideological phenomenon because it's really several different things. It's not one coherent ideology, one coherent message that we can kind of, pick apart with arguments. They want different things, these groups, and so it's very difficult to undermine it with a sort of an information strategy. Maybe there was a time, years back when there was a more coherent message that we could have targeted, but that's no longer the case.
Thank you. I'm going to now recognize Mr. Schneider from Illinois for 5 minutes, and then we'll go to Mr. Perry for 5 minutes from Pennsylvania. Go ahead.
Thank you. Dr. Hagehammer, you talked about Sinai and the concentration or increasing numbers of militants, operatives, terrorists gathering in Sinai. Where in Sinai are they gathering?
Well, I think Mr. Jocelyn may know more of the details here, but I suspect that most of the bases and the sort of the arms caches are up in the mountains, where the reach of the Egyptian police is limited.
It's the northern Sinai, principally. Northern Sinai, yeah. What gives me a big, I think what Thomas said about the security forces, the pressure from both Israel and security forces is right. My one big problem, concern there is that they've overrun security forces in places like Al-Arsh and elsewhere, and they've also been able to mount limited attacks via rockets and elsewhere in Israel and that sort of thing. So you're going to see a pickup in a tempo there.
And that's kind of where I'm going with the questions. And we saw today, I think 3 Egyptian police were killed in Sinai. They are having an increasing freedom of movement, but that mountainous area is a difficult area. Between the, I don't know if we call it a nascent government emerging in Egypt and Israel and U.S. support for both of them, what strategy should we be taking there to make sure that al-Qaeda doesn't get another foothold in Sinai?
Well, we certainly have to support, this is a tough situation because you have the politics of the whole thing and then you have the security concerns of the whole thing, and oftentimes they can conflict. But we certainly have to support some measures security-wise from the Egyptian regime against the al-Qaeda presence there, just because it's a growing presence and it's going to be a threat to our interests around the region. Again, the big problem is balancing that with our other interests inside Egypt.
Dr. Hegehammer, any thoughts on that?
I think I concur with that pretty much exactly. It's a trade-off between democracy in Egypt and security in Egypt, and so that it's a political issue. Where is that balancing point? You can't have both at this point.
And I would posit that the balancing point moves over time. We have to manage that process across time. And I'll turn to you, Dr. Jones, because it is a different world with the internet where messages can go from Afghanistan or Pakistan across the entire Middle East and even into this country. What messages, and I'll open this to everyone, do you think we need to be communicating and working with our allies to help them communicate so that we can start to win the battle of hearts and minds as well as the battle on the ground?
Well, I think part of this is providing a forum for legitimate Muslim leaders with support networks to get their views out. And because when young, impressionable kids, because that's who many of them are, not all of them, are surfing through the internet and involved in jihadist forums, they need a balance of views. I mean, ultimately, this means giving a forum to legitimate individuals. If you take the example of solidarity in Poland during the Cold War, we didn't have to create anything. It was giving air to legitimate locals. I mean, this is, I think, what we're talking about now, legitimate moderate networks, giving them the space and the ability to air their views and to directly denounce al-Qaeda. One of al-Qaeda's most significant pushbacks over the last several years was Dr. Fadl in Egypt, who put out a book that denounced Ayman al-Zawahiri. It led to huge fissures. That is the kind of stuff, I think, letting that air is quite useful.
Are there other names of people we should be watching or reaching out to in the Arab world that are, in that sense, the legitimate voice or a legitimate voice that can push back on the message of al-Qaeda and other groups like that?
There are a whole range of people, sure. There are a whole range of people across Egypt, across Saudi Arabia. I can push your names of individuals that have outright denounced Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri's vision of Islam as un-Islamic. Yeah.
So not for here, but if you could give us that would be helpful. So I would welcome those names. Dr. Kagan, you look like you have something to add, or
just to testify to what Seth is saying, having seen it on the ground, as I said, in Afghanistan, the effectiveness of this. And there were times when those Jordanian preachers were preaching, and there were Taliban in the audience who were asking them questions and getting confused because they weren't winning the arguments. This is now, Afghanistan is, there's a highly illiterate population. It was easy to mislead them, and Egypt is more cosmopolitan. It's harder. But giving voice to the people who will make these arguments, and especially, as Seth says, in the areas like in Saudi Arabia, like in Jordan, where there have been very effective de-radicalization programs, we should be building on that. We should be helping them to build on it. And we should be asking them what we can do to help them build on it, because it's in their interest as well.
So if I can just take the prerogative for one more second, I think that's critical. I think those are the types of investments we can make with a very high return on investment. So I appreciate it. Again, I thank you all for your time.
Thank you for your questions. The Chair will now recognize Mr. Perry from Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks again, gentlemen. Interested in your perspective, al-Qaeda's influence in the camps, the refugee camps that have become somewhat like cities in Jordan and what those are, what we can look forward to in the near future or the further term as Syria grinds on. And then I'd like, why don't we do that and see how much time we have left to talk a little strategy.
Just very briefly, Jabhat al-Nusra has recruited fighters out of camps, refugee camps in Lebanon, has recruited individuals out of Jordan, and has recruited individuals in particular out of camps in Turkey. So it is a great way for these organizations to recruit, gain some funding, but also to gain intelligence about pipelines. In fact, it's worth noting that the most significant pipeline of fighters moving into Syria right now is through Turkey, and which is a NATO country. And so in that sense, there's been a lot of recruitment in Turkey in particular.
Did you have something you wanted to add, Mr.?
Just real quick, that's right. There's, in fact, the al-Qaeda in Iraq network that sort of Jabhat al-Nusra has built itself off of includes very prominent figures in Jordan who do that recruiting, and they've been doing that recruiting since back in your days when you're deployed in Iraq. It's some of the same network guys are sending fighters into Syria today, including a guy who goes by the Nom de Guerre, Abu Sayyaf. He's very prominent in doing that. So it's the same, very much in that regard, the same type of enemy you faced in Iraq.
So then, do we need to be concerned about not only recruiting in the camps and transition across geographical boundaries, but influence in those nation states where the camps are, in Turkey and Jordan, and what that portends? Do we need to be concerned or not, and how much?
I think we absolutely need to be concerned. We also need to be concerned about the spillover of violence into several of these countries. Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon in particular are three areas where there is a possibility not just of initial recruitment or additional recruitment, but also the spillover of violence, not just sectarian violence, although that's part of it. But yeah, this is the potential for regional spillover.
If I can add that I agree completely that there's a very distinct risk of spillover, but I'm not entirely sure whether the refugee camps should be the main concern here. After all, these are people who've left the conflict, so they've taken the decision not to join it. And if you look back at Iraq, hundreds of thousands of people left Iraq at the height of the conflict, and they produced relatively little spillover in the region. There are certainly examples, but compared to the scale of the exodus, the security implications were not all that large. So, in the best scenario, you get something similar from Syria, but I think we should keep an eye on sort of multiple ways in which the spillover can happen, not just the refugee camps.
And maybe rightly or wrongly, I just see the camps as somewhat large, sprawling, lawless almost cities at this point without government structures and so on and so forth that lend itself to that type of activity. I guess on the other side of the equation, it lends itself to our ability to be involved and be present and gather intelligence and so on and so forth. I'm just wondering how acute the threat may be. If we could move on. Regarding the previous line of questioning, the strategy that the United States should take regarding our pseudo-allies like Qatar, like Kuwait, who will have actors within that will be willing to fund, and that's really, I think, hard for their government or us to influence. But the state itself, if the states themselves are sponsoring through funding, what should be our strategy? I know it's a delicate circumstance, but what would you folks think should be our best plan for that?
I want to make it clear that I've seen reports that there are Kuwaiti funding and so forth, but I'm not sure exactly who or what, and it's something that I think merits looking into. My first question, and I was surprised by that, candidly. I would not have expected that. And so my first suggestion would be getting to the bottom of whether that's true or not and why that's being tolerated in a state like that, where there is a much greater ability of the family to influence that kind of thing. Qatar is an entirely different problem because Qatar maintains its sort of balancing position between Saudi and Iran and us and with Al Jazeera and with al-Qaeda. They have a new emir. He's a young guy. It may conceivably be possible to help him see the light some more and help him understand that the policies he's been pursuing have not been helpful to him in the region, which is in fact true.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield.
Thank you. Gentlemen, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being in here because we rely on you guys, the experts, to inform us so that we can help influence foreign policy. And if you can bear one more question, it's a three-part question. It'll be real quick. What role should the U.S. play in Syria? To what capacity? And would it stabilize or destabilize that region more, with the spillover into Jordan, the threat to Israel, in that whole area? And if you can just say what your thoughts are on that briefly, I would greatly appreciate it. Go ahead, Dr. Jones.
I think the U.S. role in Syria should be to support the overthrow of the Assad regime. I think it's in U.S. interests. I do think one has to be very careful about the how one does that and who one is providing both lethal and non-lethal assistance to. But I think this is a covert, clandestine war. This is really one that's done by the U.S. intelligence community and special operations forces. And I think if it is not done, we will not be able to influence the end results, none of which will be in our interest.
Okay, Dr. Kagan.
I agree with that. I think this is not a case where putting a lot of U.S. boots on the ground is wise, and I would not advocate for that. I'm not sure that our role can be entirely clandestine. I think that there may be a requirement to do damage to the Syrian ability to use its airfields to receive critical supplies from Iran and other places, and also to conduct operations. I do not think that a full no-fly zone would be necessary at this point. I think there's much more nuance in that discussion than we've had so far in what kinds of tools we could apply beyond covert aid to assist. But I think it's absolutely vital, because I think that all the trend lines are that the longer this conflict goes and the way that it's going, the more destabilizing it will be, the more spillover there will be, and the more damage to American interests and security there will be.
Mr. Jocelyn.
Just real quick, in terms of sponsoring the Syrian opposition, I'm for it as long as we have a very good idea of how our enemies are constituted and what groups they're working with.
Right.
They can't co-opt them, and that's a very difficult black box a lot of times, and obviously that's why we're still talking about it. As far as destabilization, it's already about as destabilized as it can get, and I can't see it getting any better absent U.S. intervention or intervention from the outside world. That it doesn't mean boots on the ground, but there are definitely, it's a destabilizing factor. And lastly, just real quick, that there's already been a threat to this to U.S. interests out of Syria, which needs to be highlighted more often, which is that last year the Jordanian regime, the kingdom, shut down a very complicated plot to attack the U.S. Embassy that involved staging attacks against other targets and sort of build up to a massive attack on the U.S. Embassy. You're already seeing that type of spillover, and those were Jabata, and those were trained fighters throughout the region.
Doc?
My view is that the U.S. should provide weapons to the moderate part of the Syrian opposition, but it should also do two things. One is to make absolutely clear to the Syrian opposition how much support they can expect to get. Because the biggest problem with providing a little bit of support is that you can get drawn in, you have the sort of slippery slope phenomenon, and so you can get maybe see part of the Syrian opposition taking risks that they otherwise wouldn't take because they think they have the American support. So, if you provide a little, then make absolutely clear where the line goes, and make it, make sure to communicate that this does not mean that there's more to follow in case there is a crisis. The other thing that is crucial is to prepare for the civil war that comes after the fall of Assad. There will be one, and it will be crucial to plan for that and to distribute the resources with that conflict and the constellations in that conflict in mind.
Gentlemen, again, I appreciate it. I know the members of this committee appreciate it, and Congress appreciates your expertise in being here. And thank you. This subcommittee is adjourned.